Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Frost of the Cold Palace. The frost did not just cling to the windows of the Lesser Pavilion, it seemed to grow from the very floorboards. Carlton Keith exhaled, watching the pale plume of his breath dissipate into the shadows of his bedchamber. It was the third winter of his silence. In the Cresan Empire, the rank of Concubine was meant to be a title of prestige, yet for Carlton, it was a slow-acting sentence of erasure. He was the son of a fallen house, wed to Emperor Mitchell Burke in a hurried ceremony to settle a border dispute that had long since been forgotten. Mitchell had not looked at him then, and he certainly did not look for him now. "The charcoal delivery is late again, my lord," a small voice whispered. It was Sora, the only servant who hadn't bribed their way into a more lucrative position in the inner palace. "It isn't coming, Sora," Carlton replied, his fingers trembling as he tucked them into the threadbare sleeves of his robe. He sat at a small, warped desk, meticulously cleaning a calligraphy brush. The master of stores has a short memory for those who don't hold the emperor's favor. "We will burn the old bamboo screens in the courtyard tonight. They're dry enough." "But those were your father's gifts," Sora lamented. "My father is a ghost, and this pavilion is a tomb. We might as well be warm while we inhabit it." Carlton turned his gaze toward the distant, shimmering spires of the central sun palace. From here, the emperor's residence looked like a crown of gold set against the jagged mountains. Somewhere in those halls, Mitchell Burke was likely presiding over a feast or moving pieces on a war map, his heart as impenetrable as the obsidian throne he sat upon. Carlton remembered the man's eyes from their wedding day, eyes the color of a winter sea, devoid of warmth, looking through Carlton as if he were made of glass. Suddenly, the inkwell on Carlton's desk rattled. He froze. It wasn't the wind. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the soles of his boots, a sound so deep it felt less like a noise and more like a heartbeat echoing from the crust of the earth itself. "An earthquake?" Sora gasped, clutching a pillar. Carlton stood, his heart hammering against his ribs. The vibration intensified, turning into a roar that didn't come from the sky, but from the depths of the mountain beneath them. In the distance, the bells of the great temple began to toll a frantic, clanging alarm that Carlton had only read about in history scrolls. A massive crack split the flagstones of the courtyard outside. A blinding, violet light erupted from the fissure, turning the freezing twilight into a garish, impossible noon. Carlton ran to the window, shielding his eyes. He expected to see the destruction of the palace. Instead, he felt a sudden, violent pull in his chest, as if an invisible hook had snagged his soul. The air in the Lesser Pavilion grew heavy with the scent of ozone and ancient cedar. Then, the ground groaned one last time as a massive, clawed hand, scaled and shimmering midnight black, tore through the earth of the garden. A head, crested with horns of translucent ivory, rose from the dust. Mursem the Eternal Dragon, the sleeping guardian of the Burke line, had returned. The beast didn't fly toward the gold spires. It didn't seek its master on the throne. The dragon turned its colossal, golden eye toward the crumbling balcony of the Lesser Pavilion. It let out a low, rumbling huff that shattered the remaining glass in the window frames, and for the first time in 3 years, Carlton Keith didn't feel cold. He felt a searing, proprietary heat spreading from the dragon's gaze directly into his blood. "You," a voice echoed, not in the air, but inside Carlton's mind, ancient and hungry. Finally. Chapter 2, The Awakening of Mursem. The silence that followed the dragon's psychic greeting was more deafening than the roar had been. For 300 years, the Cresan Empire had prayed for this moment. In the high hall of the central sun palace, Mitchell Burke had been standing before a gathering of skeptical dukes, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He had been mid-sentence, defending his right to the throne despite the dragon's centuries-long silence, when the world had buckled. Now, Mitchell stood on the royal dais, his breath hitching as he watched the impossible silhouette of Mursem the Eternal Dragon rise over the palace walls. But the pride he expected to feel, the vindication of his bloodline, was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp confusion. "The beast, it's moving away from the Sun Palace," hissed the Grand Vizier, his face ashen. Mitchell didn't wait for a formal escort. He vaulted over the railing of the balcony, his heavy fur-lined cloak snapping in the wind as he sprinted toward the lower districts. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm. Why is it there? Why has it gone to the slums of the inner circle? Back in the garden of the Lesser Pavilion, Carlton Keith was paralyzed. The sheer scale of Mursem was a physical weight, pressing the air from his lungs. The dragon's snout was mere feet from the balcony, its nostrils flaring as it took in Carlton's scent. Each scale was the size of a shield, shimmering with a dull, oil-slick iridescence. "My lord, move! Get back!" Sora cried out from the shadows of the room, but Carlton couldn't move. The dragon tilted its massive head, its golden eye, slit with a pupil of deep crimson, narrowing. Slowly, with a grace that defied its gargantuan size, Mursem lowered its head until its forehead pressed against the trembling wood of the balcony. "The blood is thin in the one on the throne," the voice rumbled in Carlton's skull, vibrating his very teeth. "But in you, I find the resonance of the old stars. I choose the hearth that kept its flame in the frost." "I have nothing," Carlton whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing the cold, hard surface of a horn. "I am a discarded shadow. You have made a mistake." A low, thunderous purr shook the pavilion. A dragon does not mistake its own heart. A flash of movement caught Carlton's eye. At the gate of the courtyard, a troop of Imperial guards burst through, their silver armor clattering. At their head was Mitchell. The Emperor halted, his boots skidding on the frost-dusted stone. Mitchell's eyes, usually so calculated and distant, were wide with an expression Carlton had never seen on him, raw, naked shock. The Emperor looked at his ancestral guardian, the source of all his earthly power, and saw it bowing to the man he had left to rot in the dark. "Carlton?" Mitchell's voice was barely audible over the crackling energy in the air. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if to reclaim what was his. Mursem's reaction was instantaneous. The dragon's neck snapped toward the Emperor, a guttering flame of violet heat dancing deep in its throat. A terrifying growl erupted from the beast, a sound of such pure rejection that the guards fell to their knees. "Stay back, Mitchell," Carlton warned, his own voice sounding foreign to his ears. The dragon turned back to Carlton, ignoring the Emperor entirely, and began to coil its massive body around the Lesser Pavilion, effectively walling it off from the rest of the world. As the obsidian tail swept past, it shattered the stone gate Mitchell stood behind, sending a clear message to the sovereign of Cresant. The dragon had woken. But it had not woken for the king. Chapter 3, The Binding Ritual. The sky over the Cresan Empire had turned a bruised, electric purple. The Lesser Pavilion, once a symbol of Mitchell's neglect, was now the epicenter of the world. The life thread, a glowing, ethereal tether of violet light, had manifested, stretching from the center of Carlton's chest to the great heart scale on Mursem's throat. It pulsed with a steady, rhythmic thrum, a biological clock shared between a forgotten man and a primordial god. Mitchell Burke stood amidst the rubble of the courtyard gate, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of his sword. He was the Emperor, the scion of the sun, yet he felt like a trespasser in his own home. The guards behind him remained face down in the dirt. To stand in the presence of a rejecting dragon was to invite immediate incineration. "Move aside," Mitchell commanded, though his voice lacked its usual iron. He stepped over a jagged shard of masonry, his eyes locked on Carlton, who stood on the balcony framed by the dragon's massive coils. Mursem let out a hiss that sent a spray of sparks across the frost. The dragon's tail tightened around the pavilion, the ancient wood groaning under the pressure. "He won't let you pass, Mitchell," Carlton called down. He felt a strange, dizzying lucidity. Through the bond, he could feel Mitchell's irritation, a prickly, sharp sensation, and beneath that, a hollow, echoing fear. "He senses your intent. He senses that you see him as a tool, not a sovereign. I am the sovereign. Mitchell snapped, taking another step. The dragon's head descended like a falling mountain, snapping its jaws inches from Mitchell's face. The heat from Mursem's breath singed the fur on the Emperor's cloak. Mitchell froze, his breath hitching. For the first time in his life, he was staring into the eyes of the power he claimed to represent, and it was looking at him with utter disdain. The ritual must be completed, Mursem's voice echoed, not just in Carlton's mind this time, but as a low vibration that everyone could feel in their marrow. The vessel is empty. The flame is cold. The Emperor must kneel to the bonded, or the Empire shall crumble into ash by morning. The color drained from Mitchell's face. Kneel? You ask the son of the sun to kneel to a... He stopped, the word concubine dying in his throat as he looked up at Carlton. Carlton looked different. The soot on his cheeks couldn't hide the strange, celestial glow emanating from his skin. The threadbare robes seemed to shimmer as if woven with starlight. He wasn't the moping, silent shadow Mitchell had discarded, he was the anchor for the Empire's soul. If the ritual is not completed, the Grand Vizier shouted from a safe distance, his voice trembling, the dragon's mana will overflow. It will level the capital. Your Majesty, you must bridge the gap. You must touch the bonded. Mitchell looked at Carlton, really looked at him, for the first time in years. He saw the shivering man who had survived his cruelty, now holding the leash of a god. With a jaw set so tight it looked ready to break, Mitchell slowly, agonizingly, descended to one knee in the slush and dirt. Carlton Keith, Mitchell said, his voice raw. Come down. Help me, save the city. Carlton descended the creaking stairs, the dragon's coils parting just enough to let him through. As he reached the courtyard, he stood before the kneeling Emperor. The power rolling off Mursem was intoxicating, a heat that finally chased the 3-year chill from Carlton's bones. He reached out a hand. Mitchell took it. The moment their skin met, the binding ritual ignited. A pillar of light shot into the heavens, and a searing pain, half agony, half ecstasy, surged through them both. Mitchell gasped, his head snapping back as he was forced to share Carlton's senses. He felt the cold of the pavilion, the hunger of the winter months, and the crushing weight of Carlton's loneliness. And Carlton felt the Emperor's burden, the suffocating pressure of 1,000 voices demanding he be perfect, and the terrifying realization that without this man he had ignored, he was nothing at all. The violet light faded, leaving them both gasping in the dark. The life thread remained, glowing softly between them. They were no longer strangers living in the same palace. They were now two halves of a singular, draconic fate. Mitchell didn't let go of Carlton's hand. He couldn't. If he did, he felt as though he might simply drift away into the shadows. The rooms are prepared in the Sun Palace, Mitchell whispered, his voice shaking. You cannot stay here anymore. I never wanted to stay here, Carlton replied, his voice gaining a new, sharp edge. But don't mistake this for a homecoming, Mitchell. I am here because the dragon wills it. Not you. Chapter 4, The Forced Migration. The transition from the freezing outskirts to the heart of the Cresan Empire was not a procession, it was a siege. Mursem did not fly to the central Sun Palace. He walked. The great dragon moved through the capital streets with Carlton Keith perched trembling but upright upon his obsidian shoulder. Each step of the beast shook the foundations of the city, a rhythmic reminder that the power dynamic of the Empire had shifted overnight. Mitchell Burke rode on horseback just ahead, his back a rigid line of tension, forced to lead a parade for the man he had spent 3 years trying to forget. When they reached the Sun Palace, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air here was warm, heated by gold-piped vents and massive hearths, but to Carlton, it felt thinner, more dangerous than the cold. The east wing has been cleared for you, Mitchell said, dismounting his horse. He stood at the foot of the dragon, looking up. The Emperor was back in his element, surrounded by white marble and bowing servants, yet he looked diminished. The violet life thread still pulsed between them, a ghostly umbilical cord that thrummed whenever Mitchell moved more than 20 paces away. Carlton slid down from Mursem's shoulder, his legs weak. Immediately, a swarm of attendants rushed forward, clutching silks of crimson and gold. "Don't touch me," Carlton snapped, his voice echoing in the courtyard. The servants froze. For years, he had been a ghost, being the center of their frantic, fawning energy felt like a second skin he hadn't asked to wear. "They are here to prepare you for the court, Carlton," Mitchell said, his eyes narrowing. "You cannot represent the crown in rags." "I am not representing the crown," Carlton countered, stepping toward the Emperor until the life thread glowed a fierce, warning purple. "I am representing the dragon. If your court finds my rags offensive, they can take it up with Mursem." As if on cue, the dragon let out a low, vibrating rumble that rattled the windows of the throne room. Mursem didn't head for the imperial stables. Instead, he crawled onto the roof of the east wing, his massive weight causing the rafters to groan as he curled around the spire, effectively claiming Carlton's new quarters as his nest. Inside the suite, the luxury was staggering. There were baths of scented oil, tapestries depicting the founding of Cresant, and a bed large enough for 5 men. But as Mitchell followed him in, forced by the tether to stay within the same suite, the opulence felt like a cage. "You'll have to stay here," Mitchell said, pacing the length of the rug. "The bond, it won't let me leave the wing while you're in this state of agitation. I have a council meeting in an hour. I have an empire to run." "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you let your dragon starve for affection," Carlton said, sitting on the edge of the plush bed. He looked at his hands, red and chapped from the cold of the Lesser Pavilion, now resting on silk that cost more than a village. "You're frustrated because you can't command me. You're frustrated because for the first time in your life, the Emperor wills it doesn't mean a damn thing to the creature that gives you your power." Mitchell stopped his pacing. He turned, his face a mask of cold fury, and stepped into Carlton's personal space. The life thread flared, the heat of it singing the air between them. "I did what I had to do to keep this empire from tearing itself apart," Mitchell hissed, leaning down until they were eye to eye. "I didn't have the luxury of a hearth or companionship. I had a throne of glass and 1,000 knives aimed at my back. And you thought leaving me to freeze was one of the knives you could ignore?" Carlton didn't flinch. He couldn't. With Mursem's mind pressed against his, he felt the dragon's ancient, towering pride. Mitchell's gaze dropped to Carlton's lips, then back to his eyes. For a fleeting second, the anger in the Emperor's expression wavered, replaced by a haunting flash of recognition, a memory of the boy Carlton had been on their wedding night, before the silence had set in. The moment was shattered by a sharp knock on the double doors. "Your Majesty," the vizier's voice muffled through the wood. "The dukes are demanding to see the bonded. They say a dragon that perches on the east wing is a dragon that has abandoned the throne." Mitchell straightened his tunic, his mask snapping back into place. He looked at Carlton, his expression unreadable. "Dress yourself. If we are to be chained together by fate, you will at least look like a sovereign when we go out there to lie to them." "I won't be lying, Mitchell," Carlton said, standing up. "The dragon chose. That's the only truth they need." Chapter 5, Whispers of the High Court. The Moonlit banquet was not a celebration, it was a dissection. The great hall of the Sun Palace was a cavern of shimmering quartz and gold, filled with the sharp scent of lilies and the underlying metallic tang of hidden daggers. Every noble in the Cresan Empire was present, their eyes darting between the Emperor and the man who sat, for the first time, in the chair to his immediate right. Carlton felt like a specimen under a glass lens. He was draped in heavy, midnight blue velvet, his hair pinned back with a single ivory clip carved from a dragon's shed scale. The violet life thread hummed between him and Mitchell, visible as a faint, shimmering haze that linked their shadows. "Smile, Carlton," Mitchell murmured under his breath, his hand gripping a chalice of wine so tightly his knuckles were white. "The Duke of Eris has been staring at your throat for 10 minutes, wondering if the bond is a parlor trick." "Perhaps I should have Mursem eat his carriage," Carlton replied, his voice cool and steady. "That might settle his curiosity." Mitchell's lips twitched, a ghost of a smirk that he quickly suppressed. A tempting thought, but let's try diplomacy first. The music, a frantic, high-pitched arrangement of lutes, did little to mask the whispers. Carlton could hear them. The discarded boy? How could Mursem choose a Keith? The Emperor looks like a prisoner in his own house. It was the Duchess of Vallis who finally struck. She approached the high table, her fan clicking shut like a guillotine. Your Majesty, we are all heartened by the dragon's return. But surely, a scholar from the Lesser Pavilions lacks the fortitude to channel Mursem's mana. Should the Empire's defense rely on such a delicate vessel? Mitchell opened his mouth to deliver a practiced, imperial dismissal, but Carlton beat him to it. Fortitude, Duchess? Carlton stood, his velvet robes sweeping against the stone. He didn't look at her, he looked through her. I spent 3 years in a pavilion where the ink froze in the wells by December. I survived on the neglect of this court and the silence of a husband who forgot my name. If I can survive the emptiness of this palace, your mana is merely a summer breeze. The hall fell into a suffocating silence. Mitchell looked up at Carlton, his oceanic eyes widening. He had expected a victim who needed shielding. He found a blade that had been sharpened in the dark. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down into drunken murmurs, the pair retreated to the balcony overlooking the imperial gardens. The air was crisp, and above them, the massive silhouette of Mursem shifted on the roof, his scales clicking like tectonic plates. You shouldn't have provoked her, Mitchell said, though there was no heat in his words. He stood close, he had to, and the proximity was beginning to feel less like a chore and more like a magnet. She needed to know that the delicate vessel has teeth, Carlton said. He reached for the stone railing, but his hand brushed Mitchell's. The reaction was instantaneous. A physical shock, like a bolt of lightning, slammed through both of them. It wasn't just a touch, it was a bridge. Through the life thread, the dragon's energy surged, forcing their senses to overlap. For a staggering second, Carlton felt Mitchell's bone-deep exhaustion, the weight of a crown that felt like a leaden vice. And Mitchell felt the sudden, terrifying heat of Carlton's defiance, mixed with a hidden, aching desire to be seen, not as a consort, not as a bondmate, but as a man. They both recoiled, gasping. The violet thread between them pulsed with a frantic, neon light. What was that? Mitchell breathed, his hand trembling as he pressed it to his chest, right where the thread anchored to his heart. The dragon, Carlton whispered, his heart racing. He isn't just linking our lives, Mitchell. He's merging them. He's tired of us pretending we aren't tied together. Mitchell looked at Carlton in the moonlight, the coldness in his gaze finally beginning to crack. I am starting to realize, the Emperor said softly, that I didn't just ignore a concubine. I ignored the only person in this palace who isn't afraid to look me in the eye. Before Carlton could respond, a low, ominous growl vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a growl of anger, but of warning. High above, Mursem's eyes snapped open, glowing like twin suns. The whispers of the court were over. The shadows were starting to move. Chapter 6, The Dragon's Trial. The air in the imperial gardens didn't just turn cold, it turned stagnant. The chirping of the night cicadas cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched, metallic ringing that made Carlton's ears bleed. Mitchell, Carlton gasped, clutching his head. Through the bond, he felt a wave of nausea that wasn't his own. It was Mursem. The dragon was thrashing on the roof of the east wing, his massive claws gouging deep furrows into the gold-leafed masonry. Assassins, Mitchell hissed, drawing his sword in one fluid motion. He didn't look for men with blades, he looked for the source of the smell, a cloying, sweet scent like rotting peaches. Alchemical mist. They aren't targeting us, they're targeting the dragon. A thick, violet-gray vapor began to rise from the floor vents of the balcony. It was Dragon's Bane, a forbidden concoction designed to curdle a dragon's mana. Above them, Mursem let out a strangled cry, his golden eyes clouding over. The life thread between Carlton and Mitchell began to fray, sparking violently like a downed power line. "If the bond snaps while the mana is unstable, we all die," Mitchell shouted over the dragon's pained roars. He grabbed Carlton's shoulders, pulling him close. "Carlton, look at me. We can't fight this physically. We have to stabilize his mind. We have to go in." "In where?" Carlton cried, his vision blurring. "The mindscape. Close your eyes and hold on to me. Do not let go, or you'll be lost in his fever." Carlton gripped Mitchell's forearms, burying his face into the Emperor's chest. The world tilted. The stones beneath their feet vanished, replaced by a plummeting sensation that felt like falling through a sea of liquid fire. They slammed into a reality of shifting shadows and broken glass. This was the dragon's mindscape, the subconscious of a 300-year-old god. It was a wasteland of memories. "Stay close," Mitchell commanded. Here, the Emperor didn't look like a sovereign. His armor was gone, leaving him in a simple white tunic, his soul laid bare. As they moved through the gloom, the mindscape began to react to their presence. The shadows rippled, playing back scenes like a haunted theater. Carlton saw a younger Mitchell, standing in this very spot, crying silently as his father told him that love was a weakness that would get him killed. He saw the day Mitchell had signed the decree to send Carlton to the Lesser Pavilion, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate, panicked need to distance himself from the only person who made his pulse quicken. "You were afraid," Carlton whispered, watching the memory Mitchell turn away from a portrait of a smiling Carlton. Mitchell stood frozen, watching his own past. "I thought if I didn't care for you, no one could use you against me. I thought I was protecting the throne. I didn't realize I was just building my own cage." The ground shook as a corrupted version of Mursem, a skeletal, shadow-wreathed beast, loomed over them. The poison had taken the form of a great serpent, constricting the dragon's heart. "We have to burn it out," Carlton said, stepping forward. He reached out, not for a weapon, but for the life thread. He realized now that the thread wasn't just a leash, it was a conduit. He grabbed Mitchell's hand, lacing their fingers together. "The dragon chose me because I survived the cold. You survived the pressure. Together, we are the fire." Mitchell looked at their joined hands, then up at Carlton. The mask of the Emperor was gone, replaced by a man who was finally ready to stop fighting alone. "Together," he echoed. They channeled their shared essence, the years of loneliness, the hidden longing, the newfound defiance, into the bond. A blinding white light erupted from their joined hands, a pure, scorching heat that tasted of cedar and ozone. The light swept across the wasteland, incinerating the alchemical shadows and shattering the serpent of poison. Mursem's roar changed from a scream of agony to a clarion call of victory. The mindscape dissolved. Carlton blinked, finding himself back on the balcony, collapsed in Mitchell's arms. The mist was gone, dissipated by a single, massive flap of Mursem's wings. The dragon sat atop the palace, his eyes clear and burning with a renewed, fierce light. Mitchell didn't pull away. He held Carlton tightly, his forehead resting against Carlton's. Both were drenched in sweat, their hearts beating in a perfect, synchronized rhythm. They tried to break the bond, Mitchell whispered into the crook of Carlton's neck, his voice trembling with a rare, raw emotion. "But they only showed me exactly what I've been missing for 3 years." Below in the gardens, the sounds of guards apprehending the assassins echoed, but for the first time, the Emperor didn't care about the politics. He only cared about the man in his arms who had just saved his soul. Chapter 7, The Thaw. The immediate aftermath of the mindscape was a silence so profound it felt heavy. The alchemical mist had cleared, leaving the balcony slick with a shimmering, oily residue, but the air was finally sweet again. Mitchell did not let go. His arms were locked around Carlton's waist, his face buried in the crook of Carlton's neck as he breathed in the scent of ink and cold ozone. For a man who had spent his reign as a statue of ice, the heat radiating from him now was staggering. He was trembling, not with fear, but with the violent collapse of his own walls. I saw it, Mitchell whispered, his voice cracking against Carlton's skin. In the shadows of Mursem's mind. I saw the 3 years I stole from you. I saw the frost on your windows and the way you stopped looking at the Sun Palace because it hurt too much to hope. Carlton stayed still, his heart thudding against Mitchell's chest. The violet life thread was no longer a frantic, sparking wire, it had settled into a deep, resonant glow, flowing between them like liquid amethyst. You were afraid of being human, Mitchell. You thought the crown required you to be a void. Mitchell pulled back just enough to look at him. The Emperor's hair was disheveled, his royal robes torn, and his eyes, those winter sea eyes, were brimming with a devastating clarity. I was a coward. I told myself I was protecting the Empire by being heartless, but I was just protecting myself from the pain of losing you. I thought if I didn't love you, the vipers in this court couldn't use you to break me. He reached up, his thumb brushing a smudge of soot from Carlton's cheek with a tenderness that felt more revolutionary than the dragon's awakening. And instead, Carlton said, his voice soft but firm, you let the cold do the breaking for them. Never again, Mitchell vowed. He led Carlton back into the bedchamber, dismissing the frantic guards and physicians with a sharp flick of his hand. He slammed the heavy oak doors, locking out the world, the politics, and the prying eyes of the nobility. For the first time in the history of the Cresan Empire, the Emperor was truly alone with his consort. There was no formal ceremony here, no courtly distance. Mitchell sat on the edge of the expansive bed and pulled Carlton down beside him. The room was warm, the hearth crackling with a fire that seemed to roar in sympathy with the dragon outside. The bond is stable now, Carlton noted, looking at the glowing tether. Mursem is, he's purring. He's satisfied, Mitchell said, a tired, genuine smile finally touching his lips. He took Carlton's hand, lacing their fingers together. He didn't look at the hand as a symbol of political alliance, but as something precious. He didn't choose you just to save the Empire, Carlton. He chose you to save me. They spent the night not in passion, but in a long overdue reckoning. They spoke of the things that had been buried under 3 years of silence, of Carlton's secret gardens, of Mitchell's sleepless nights watching the horizon, of the terrifying burden of the draconic bloodline. As the first light of dawn began to bleed through the curtains, Mitchell leaned in. It wasn't the kiss of a sovereign claiming a prize, it was a slow, tentative plea for forgiveness. When their lips met, the life thread flared with a brilliant, blinding warmth. The ice had finally melted. The forgotten concubine was gone, and in his place was a man who held the heart of a king and the soul of a dragon. The Empire would wake to a new world, but for now, in the quiet of the dawn, Mitchell Burke finally allowed himself to be nothing more than a man who loved his husband. Chapter 8, The Sovereigns of Cresant. The morning of the dual coronation did not break with the usual oppressive heat of the Cresan Empire. Instead, the air was crisp, charged with a shimmering vitality that seemed to ripple off the very stones of the palace. Inside the dressing chambers of the central Sun Palace, Carlton Keith stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror of polished silver. He was no longer the soot-stained ghost of the Lesser Pavilion. He wore robes of iridescent white silk, embroidered with obsidian thread that traced the likeness of dragon scales. A heavy mantle of violet velvet hung from his shoulders, fastened by 2 interlocking golden pins, one a sun, one a dragon's claw. The door groaned open. Mitchell Burke entered, already clad in his imperial gold. He dismissed the attendants with a silent nod. The Emperor walked toward Carlton, his reflection joining his husband's in the silver glass. "You look like a god," Mitchell whispered, his voice devoid of his former imperial distance. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of the life thread that now pulsed with a deep, contented violet hue against Carlton's chest. "I feel like a man who has finally come home," Carlton replied, turning to face him. He adjusted Mitchell's heavy collar, his touch lingering. "Are you ready? The dukes will be waiting to see if their sovereign has truly surrendered his heart." Mitchell leaned down, pressing his forehead against Carlton's. "I haven't surrendered it. I've finally put it in the only place it's safe." The doors to the grand balcony swung wide. The plaza below was a sea of thousands, nobles, soldiers, and commoners who had traveled for days to witness the impossible. As Mitchell and Carlton stepped out into the light, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. It wasn't just the sight of the two men standing side by side as equals, it was the shadow that suddenly eclipsed the sun. Mursem the Eternal Dragon launched himself from the heights of the East Wing. With a roar that vibrated in the very marrow of every citizen, the beast circled the spire before banking sharply. He landed on the massive stone buttresses flanking the balcony, his wings spreading wide to create a canopy of living obsidian over the two men. Mitchell stepped to the edge, his hand locked firmly in Carlton's. "People of Cresant." Mitchell's voice, amplified by the dragon's magic, rolled over the city like thunder. "For too long, this throne has been a seat of isolation. For too long, we ignored the hearth for the sake of the crown. But the Eternal Dragon has spoken. He has chosen a heart to guide our fire." Mitchell turned to Carlton, and in front of the entire empire, the cold sovereign sank to one knee. He held up a second crown, not of gold, but of polished dragonglass. "Carlton Keith, bonded of Mursem and heart of the empire. I crown you my empower consort. Your word is my decree. Your safety is my law. Your love is my life." As Mitchell placed the crown upon Carlton's head, the crowd erupted into a roar that rivaled the dragon's. The rival factions, the plotting dukes, and the judgmental duchesses were forced to bow, swept away by the sheer, undeniable power of the draconic bond. Carlton looked out over the empire he had once watched from a freezing window. He felt the heat of Mitchell's hand, the steady pulse of Mursem's mind, and the weight of a crown that no longer felt like a burden. "The frost is gone," Mursem's voice echoed in his mind, a low, satisfied rumble. "Yes," Carlton thought, leaning into Mitchell as they turned to face their people. "The spring has finally come to Cresant." The Emperor and his consort stood together under the shadow of the dragon's wings, no longer a sovereign and a discarded shadow, but two halves of a fire that would burn for centuries to come. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy the story as much as I enjoyed making it. Please do like and subscribe to help the channel grow.